So thank you guys for hanging in there and bearing with us as we had some technical difficulty. So our next presentation is Jonas De Souza, and Jonas is a technical services manager for Purdue Agribusiness Animal Nutrition, focusing his work on fatty acid nutrition. He received his bachelor's degree in animal science from Santa Catarina State University in 2011. During his master's, he focused his research on the effects of fatty acid supplementation on performance and metabolism of grazing cows, and obtained a master's degree in animal nutrition from the University of São Paulo in 2014. With a background in lipid metabolism, he expanded on this expertise while at Michigan State University under the guidance of Dr. Adam Locke, where he examined the impact of altering the dietary ratio of fatty acids on the performance and metabolism of dairy cows, and received his PhD degree in animal sciences from Michigan State University. So today, Jonas is going to spend some time talking about manipulating diets and fatty acid strategies with changes in milk prices that we're experiencing today.
Thanks for that introduction, Jackie. Hope everyone could log in now. I would like to start thanking the organizing committee for inviting me to talk about this topic. I think it's a very timely topic to be talking about. How can we manipulate diets and mainly fatty acid strategies as we see this suddenly change in milk price? So what are these changes I'm talking about is these two graphs kind of show nicely what's happened in the last year and a half in terms of butter, fat, and protein prices. So most of the milk payment system in US is based on the economic of the milk components. And as we can see last year, and for several years, we have been having, very good prices for butter fat. Last year it was another strong year, is indicated here on this green line. But since September, we start seeing a little bit of trending now on butter fat prices due to production. And in this year, the prices were still slightly trending down until COVID hit us. And then we're gonna see a very dramatic reduction in price that just happened. So this April month, last week, USDA released prices, and we are talking about butter fat being at $1.32, 33 cents, where a year ago we were talking about $2.50. So it's a very sharp decrease in the value of butter fat. I'm gonna try to navigate some of that. How perhaps can we manipulate in a couple things in our diets and thinking our strategy overall to overcome that. On the other hand, prices for protein in the last year and a half have been very strong, or have been increasing. If we compare, about a year ago where the protein prices start to increasing, the tendency for this year, as we can see here, is still having that price at least as at the same level as last year. So protein should be strong, where the major drop that probably producers are experiencing right now in their paycheck are driven by drops in butter fat price. At the same time, some of the ingredients that we use in diets to drive butter fat, like cotton and palm, they are higher this year compared to last year. So this is another factor that we have to consider in our equation here. So some of these commodities are getting higher in price, and in our payment for butter fat is reducing. So it's need to us to evaluate some of these strategies. We can calculate roughly, and this is done. You can use Sesame. That's a software developed by Norm St. Pierre, Ohio State, where you can look to prices of different ingredients and calculate the overall value or the nutrient value to produce a pound of fat, protein, and other solids. So I use these values from last week. Right now, And here I'm talking about, basal fat and basal protein. I'm not talking about, driving these through supplementation or any type of special changes in diet, but the basal fat, basal protein that a cow can produce, we can estimate today that it costs about 50 cents per pound to produce a pound of butter fat. So with a value of $1.33, we still have a net gain of 83 cents. The same with protein. Protein costs more to produce than fat generally, but with the value of $2.48, using the value for April, we still are on a positive return for these components. And I'd just like to point out that other solids, it costs about 22 cents to produce a pound of other solids. And we are paid about 18 cents today. So this reinforces that although the return of investment for basal milk fat has decreased, that is still profitable to producing butter fat. It's still profitable to produce that basal butter fat. Milk protein compared to 2 years ago has a good value today and good return over investment. So that is a component that we should be targeting today, is looking after milk protein. And overall, producing more volume, as indicated by the other solids here, and not components, has a negative impact in profitability. So although our economics had reduced, our feeding strategies, looking for components should still be maintained, should be still be our goal instead of looking for volume. One thing that we have to understand about fats in general is that fatty acids is really, which is important to talk about and to focus, is understanding that different fatty acids have different properties. They are metabolized differently in the body, and they have different effects on metabolism is the key. And some of these fatty acids will, have a different process through the rumen. They will have different digestibilities. They will affect post absorptive metabolism in a different form. So that's what I will be talking a little bit about, and how can we incorporate some of this knowledge when we are formulating diets. I've been talking about this basal fat, right? That we should be focusing, and that's still profitable to be producing. So when we think about butter fat, where the fatty acids come from? So what is the driver for milk fat? So if we can break down the milk fat and look into the milk fatty acids and see where those milk fatty acids are coming from, basically we have two main sources of fatty acids that will change milk fat synthesis. So we have the fatty acids that we call de novo fatty acids. So the de novo fatty acids are the ones that are synthesized at the mammary gland from building blocks, and those building blocks are acetate and beta-hydroxybutyrate. And that's generally the cheapest butter fat that usually we produce, because it's through the rumen fermentation, maintaining good rumen health, we can drive those de novo. So de novo fatty acids are a very important source of milk fatty acids. The second source is what we call preformed fatty acids. So they are fatty acids that are in the blood circulation, and they just uptake from in the mammary gland and incorporate in milk fat. Those fatty acids, they usually have two sources. They either are fatty acids that were absorbed, I fed in the diet, they were absorbed, they are in circulation, or they are fatty acids coming from mobilization. So of course, that is a stage lactation effect. When you think about fresh cows mobilizing more fat, having more fatty acids circulating, that's usually enrich that milk of fresh cows with preformed fatty acids. But how to manage these two classes is important. And I will give emphasis. I'll start talking about de novo, and then I'll talk about preformed fatty acids. Okay, so in terms of de novo fatty acids, so how the cow produce butter fat, I will talk about three things that we can manipulate in diets and management that can affect de novo fatty acids. So forage quality is one, feed intake, that's for me is very associated with feeding management, and very technical here, do not screw up the rumen. So everything that we do that we can hurt the rumen or change some of the rumen fermentation pattern can affect synthesis of de novo fatty acids. And I will mention a few things that we have to keep our mind and keep looking into that. So as we maximize or as we guarantee that we have a good de novo synthesis of fatty acids, then we can think about how we change or manipulate preformed fatty acids. So definitely we don't want preformed fatty acids coming from body reserves, but specifically in some lactation stage that's going to happen, but we have ways to manipulate how much the cow will lose in terms of body reserves, but also in terms of dietary fatty acids, which ones that probably if I decide to supplement, I can get better response in what's the interactions with other factors as well. So starting with de novo, as I said, de novo, as a precursors for de novo synthesis, we need acetate and beta-hydroxybutyrate. So one simple way to drive more de novo synthesis is driving more supply of those precursors, so acetate and beta-hydroxybutyrate. This was shown nicely on this study from Dr. Harvartin a couple years ago, where he infused different levels of acetate. As we can see here, there was a quadratic increase on milk fat yield and also on milk protein yield. So there was some relationship in this case in terms of rumen function, probably also driven protein. And that's an important aspect, maintaining good de novo also will guarantee that rumen working properly, probably you are maximizing or improving that microbial efficiency as well and gain milk protein. There is some reports looking to de novo in relationship to milk protein as factors that are correlated. But this of course was a proof of concept research. So how do we actually do this in practice? And we know one aspects that we have been looking is forage quality. So on this graph here, on these three graphs here, what I'm showing is the relationship. So I got a big data set that is data for about 1,500 cows here. And I look to some simple relationships here between the total track fiber digestibility, NDF digestibility, and these classes of milk fatty acid, preformed, mixed, and de novo. It's interesting that that is, although it's weak, there's a lot of noise as you can see here, but that is a relationship between fiber digestibility and those de novo and mixed fatty acids, which probably the mixed here are mixed can be partially de novo or preformed. We assume this is coming from the de novo side. So driving forage quality or maintaining higher forage quality can help you achieve those higher levels of de novo, and this is one of the aspects that we can monitor and we can change in diets, and we can positively impact with a lower cost than supplemental fat or other things. So this is one way that when we think about the scope on how producing butterfat, we can be helping producing that cheap butterfat. A couple years ago as well, Dr. Bourbano from Cornell did some very nice research looking to relationships. So he got data from different farms, classified farms, so what he called high de novo and low de novo, and looked to several parameters related to production, management, and feed. And some caught attention, specifically because some of these high de novo farms, they were correlated with lower stock density, higher feed frequency, more bunk space. And when we start to thinking about, okay, why this relationship may happen, why driving de novo or having farms with higher de novo yield can be associated with some of these feeding management parameters. So again, looking to our data set, we found something very interesting on our analysis here. Here's what I'm plotting is dry matter intake in the bottom here, and the concentration of de novo mixed or preformed. I'm plotting concentration here, but if I'm plotting yield, the graphs follow the same pattern. Which is interesting here is we found a very nice relationship between feed intake and de novo fatty acids. And that kind of help us to explain some of the, or to comprehend better some of these reports coming from Dr. Bourbano as well, where probably in farms where we keep a good feeding management, we have good management of those animals, not overcrowding, we have enough space for those cows eat, probably we are maximizing the potential intake of those cows. And that, certainly potentially drives, the amount of organic matter that's fermented in the rumen, the amount of these VFAs that are being producing that are, some of them are precursors for de novo synthesis. So that's kind of where some of the explanation between feeding management and intake they came from. So this is another way that we can impact de novo and produce that cheaper butter fat without too much cost, but looking more to management and managing feed intake is really important. The third aspect that I mentioned is talking about the rumen, right? How we maintain that really health rumen and rumen function. And when we think about fatty acids, let's consider that we're not only talking about supplemental fat or fat that I add on the diet, but fat can come from forages, from cereal grains, from other sources, from every source of ingredient that I have on a diet. When those fatty acids enter the rumen, they usually are in a triglyceride or in a galactolipid form, or they can be in a free fatty acid form. But especially those triglycerides and galactolipids, they will go through this process of hydrolysis, or the glycerol is removed, and that glycerol is usually fermented to VFA. But a lot of these fatty acids that are in the cereal grains, forages, oil seeds, they are unsaturated fatty acids. And those unsaturated fatty acids, they won't undergo through this process that we call biohydrogenation. Basically, the bugs will transform these fatty acids from an unsaturated form to a saturated form. Okay, so even though we are feeding a lot of unsaturated fatty acids, because of this rumen biohydrogenation, most of the outflow, or most of the fatty acids are leaving the rumen, usually they are very saturated. Of course, I can have other fatty acids coming from microbial cells. As microbial cells grow, bacteria or protozoa, they grow. They have fatty acids mostly in their membranes. Membranes phospholipids, for example. That's also a source of fatty acids that flow out of the rumen. Or I can have bypass fats or inert fats that some will go. They will pass through the rumen without being modified by these bugs, and they will flow as well. But focus on this biohydrogenation. Why biohydrogenation is important? Well, why do the bugs do biohydrogenation at the first place? Is because most of the unsaturated fatty acids, they are toxic to rumen bacteria. Okay, so they can disrupt membrane function. So the bacteria does that as a protection mechanism. And under a normal biohydrogenation, there is several different pathways, but in a normal biohydrogenation pathway, the most common would be you have linoleic acid, that's the predominant fatty acid that we feed and have in a cow diet, will be fully converted to stearic acid through a series of steps. But there is special circumstances where, due to altered rumen fermentation, some other fatty acids, can be produced in the rumen. And specifically, some of these trans fatty acids, they are important. Why? Because some of these trans fatty acids, they can be absorbed, they can go through circulation, reach the mammary gland, and alter the de novo synthesis. They can negatively impact that synthesis of the cheaper fat that I can produce. So what are the factors that make this biohydrogenation pathway change from normal to alter is usually there's three control points. When we look to where we can control that formation, mainly one is the excessive unsaturated fatty acid intake. So as more unsaturated fatty acid I have on a diet, that can reach a threshold where we overload the Rumen capacity, and those trans fatty acids start to accumulate and being produced more frequently. Also, changes in terms of Rumen environment that leads to reduction in pH, being for a change on the diet or a change in feed management that leads to, slug feeding or some other alteration that can cause Rumen perturbation, especially in pH, can accelerate that process. And, associated with that pH, when I have too much fermentable carbohydrates, that can also be a risk factor. So these are three things, usually we look in the diets. Most of the models, we can monitor my carbohydrate levels, fermentability today, and also those RUFO. But specifically, I'm going to talk about RUFO. And RUFO basically is that sum of unsaturated fatty acids. So there's a lot of people that look to RUFO. There is a lot of softwares that will present today RUFO values, but my caution is how we interpreted really that RUFO value. So RUFO is the summation of all my 18 1s, 2s, and 3s that I have on the diet. What I would like to point out is that not all the unsaturated fatty acids depress milk fat at the same rate. So the potential for these fatty acids to undergo this change in biohydrogenation and cause problems depend on the fatty acids. So just grouping them in a group, grouping them all together and just looking to the RUFO may be misleading. Also, I would like to point out that if I'm feeding an unsaturated fatty acid source, but that's coming from that has some type of protection, either through the natural seed, think about whole cotton or rose or beans, whole beans, or some type of salt technology, depending on the fatty acid we're talking about, that adds some protection. What I mean about adding some protection is that gives time to the bugs work through that fatty acid. So it's not only what fatty acids I'm feeding, but how fast those fatty acids, those unsaturated fatty acids, are available in the rumen. Okay, and that's also important to monitor. That is interactions, of course, with other dietary components. As I'm working with diets that are more risky, higher carbohydrates, fast carbohydrates, probably I should be holding more my RUFOs. If that's not the case, I can, be a little bit less cautious of that RUFO level. So that is some interactions that we have to be looking at. In most of the nutrition models, to my knowledge, they will present RUFO, but they will not differentiate. You're going to have RUFO, that's your value. We have been doing some work in terms of looking how dietary components affect the yield of milk fat and specific class. So this is some work, preliminary work we did. We are still incorporating data here on some of these analysis. We published this abstract a couple of years ago. And when I run simple analysis, I know that my C18-2, that linoleic acid, that's part of the RUFO, has a negative effect on de novo and mix it. So based on that analysis, we generate these graphs. We hold constant the other ingredients or the other parameters on the model. And we can predict that for every 1% that my C18-2 increases on my diet, that generates a drop in about 150 grams per day of butter fat. Okay, so my suggestion would be C18-2 should be a parameter that we should be looking, and I think is even more important than only looking to the RUFO, is looking to that C18-2 level. What's that C18-2 level is and where I am on this diet. So we don't want to be losing de novo and de novo synthesis, and really monitor that C18-2 is one factor. The second that's very important is where that C18.2 is coming from, because of course, this is the overall effect. But if I have the C18.2 coming from very fast source, think about corn oil, for example, that decrease probably is much rapidly, where if I have a protected source, that may not occur. And that's this next example here. So also looking to the database that I had available from some of my studies that I did in my PhD, we look to C18.2 here. I'm just plotting C18.2 intake versus milk fat yield. And the increase in C18.2 here across the diet was driven by whole cottonseed in the diet. So as we can see, this is the opposite relationship from the graph that I showed before. Even though C18.2 intake is increasing, milk fat yield is increasing, milk protein yield is also increasing. So in a summary, I think monitor RUFO is very important, but two questions we have to ask, which fatty acids are we increasing, C18.1, 2, or 3, and where those fatty acids are coming from. What's the main source when we are changing on a diet? Is that RUFO potentially fast RUFO, slow RUFO? Because that definitely will impact the effect on de novo. In terms of C18.1 versus C18.2, we, on our analysis, we did see positive effects of C18.1 in milk fat yield, but I think a technology that's is coming to the market and will be becoming available more and more is some of these modifications that you can do genetically in plants and naturally produce higher C18.1 versus C18.2 products. And one example is soybean. So soybean conventionally is rich in C18.2, but that is available already, these Plenish soybeans, that the C18.1 is the major fatty acid. So when I think about that, we have to consider that although both will have similar RUFO levels, they have very distinct effects. This is a trial done at the University of Wisconsin by Dr. Armentano, where he have a low-fat, no-control diet, and then either the whole or grounded conventional beans or Plenish beans. So the conventional being a C18.2 source, the Plenish being a C18.1. As we can see, regardless if we ground or we feed as a whole, butter fat was higher, milk fat yield was higher on the cows that have that C18.1 from Plenish beans. So when we monitor these, knowing that the fatty acid that we are feeding is important, and I think Plenish may become a technology that we're going to see probably more and more, and it's safer to feed than using like a conventional beans. I really believe that when we think about milk fat, we have to think about ways that we can drive milk fat from multiple sources. So as I mentioned, there is de novo, that is the preformed, there's those 16 carbon fatty acids, and looking to the ways that we can drive, all the three sources generally is better than just looking to one or the other. Right now, as I'm saying, I think the focus mainly in producing a cheaper butter fat is important, which doesn't mean that we shouldn't be looking to other ways as well. This is an example where we did a trial infusing emulsifier and changing fatty acid digestibility in cows. And what we saw was as we increased fat yield, that fat yield came from the three sources. And that's probably a better approach to be looking at than just focusing just one class. The de novos are important, but how can we also, look into alternatives to drive some of the other fatty acids as well? We also, when we think kind of during the introduction, talking a little bit more about supplemental fat and preformed fatty acids, we have to realize that fatty acids in diets, they are much more than calories. So I think we are moving on from this era when we talk about fat as a way to dense it up, the energy of the diet. we are looking much more to the specific effects of individual fatty acids and what those effects are in components, milk production, body condition, and partition of nutrients in general. And when we start doing some of this research, we realize that fatty acid profile of the supplemental fat probably is the first factor that we should be looking at, okay? And when we think about this, how to supplement fat and which ones we should be feeding, basically we from all the supplements that we have in the market, there's a big variety of different supplements. We probably can classify most of the supplements in these three buckets here. Calcium salts of palm fatty acid distillates. They are byproduct of palm oil industry. They are calcium salts. They use a calcium salt technology. They usually main fatty acids, they will have palmitic and oleic acid as the two primary fatty acids. We have the mixed fatty acid priols. Those are saturated priols. They usually are composed mainly by palmitic and stearic acid, either coming from tallow or vegetable sources. And we have palmitic acid supplements, or some people like to say palm fat. But palmitic acid supplements, they are also from the palm oils. They're also a byproduct from the palm oil industry, fractionated and increasing in concentration. So last year, Jose continued some work that we had started on putting together a database from the available literature and doing a meta-analysis on the effects of these different classes on production responses. And just going over here, this, being a meta-analysis, this is the overall effect of these different classes here. Okay, so for calcium salts, well, one thing that we did different in this meta-analysis was we limit studies that to include up to 3% of dietary supplemental fat, just to avoid some of these studies that extremely did supplemental fat, not a commercial level. So when I start to looking, what's the overall response? Usually, calcium salts of palm fatty acid, they decrease feed intake, they increase the yield of milk, they also generate increases in the yield of fat and energy correct milk. Okay, so when I plug these numbers with overall economics today and an average price for these supplements, these likely will generate a slightly positive ROI, depending on the group you're feeding and the condition you're feeding. But if you get this overall response, specifically because we usually see a decrease in feed intake as well, that's usually generates a positive ROI. The same economics on the mixed, there's no difference on feed intake. There's increase in milk, but not in the components yield. We see a lot of variation on that. Today we're being likely a negative ROI. And regarding these palmitic acid supplements, with this average response from these trials that were summarized here, you'll be also in a likely positive ROI. But remember that what we have to look is not only the response in milk and milk components. That's solely what I'm looking here when I made these comments, but other aspects in terms of health and reproduction also should drive the decision if we should add and which fatty acids should we be adding on these diets, even under these tough times. When I mentioned about the fatty acid, we characterize, I think, well already that cows respond to the fatty acid profile of the supplemental fat. This is a study we published a couple of years ago where we looked to that. And as we can see here, as we fed 4 different diets here to these cows, a control with no supplemental fat, and the same amount of supplemental fat, but changing the fatty acid profile from a high palmitic, and then we drop about half of that high palmitic with stearic acid or oleic acid. So in terms of milk volume, we didn't see no difference. These are mid-lactation cows, no difference in the magnitude of the response. They all increased compared with control, but the magnitude of response was the same. It was when we calculate the energy correct milk, accounting for the change in protein and fat, that's we see difference across the different profiles. Where the supplement containing higher palmitic increase energy correct milk by over 5 pounds, and the other two by about 2.5. So what I like about this study when I look this is when we reduce that palmitic acid to about half on that supplemental fat, we saw about half of the response in terms of energy correct milk, indicating if your major objective is to drive energy correct milk, palmitic acid is the key fatty acid to achieve that. On the other hand, again, these are post-peak cows gain weight, on positive energy balance, but we did see an interesting effect here that using palmitic and oleic was a way that we increase body weight change, and also we affect plasma insulin. And now we'll come back more to this insulin story in a bit when I talk about fresh cows, but this was kind of surprising for us. So that this research indicate to us that depending on my goal, if it's driving more milk or energy correct milk, or keeping condition, probably should be varying the fatty acid profile that I feed to these cows. In terms of palmitic acid, there is a lot of questions these days, right? With these economics of butterfat dropping, is it still feasible be feeding? How much should I be feeding? And I went back and did this analysis here where we looked to the milk fat response to palmitic acid only mid-lactation cows to avoid a confusion driven by lactation stage. And then we can calculate what we call transfer efficiency. So basically we are giving palmitic acid and we monitor fat yield, right? So we know, okay, if I gave 400 grams of palmitic acid to that cow and I increase fat yield by 100 grams, I have 25% of transfer efficiency. So when we look to some of these studies here, all in mid-lactation cows that did that, our transfer efficiency was about 23% on those mid-lactation cows. But more important was looking at the coefficient of variation, even though most of these studies are coming from the same university, it was a coefficient of variation of about 30%. So we started to investigate what factors may be affecting these. And one that we realize and we start correcting for is digestibility. So all these trials here, I have digestibility, and I could do the same calculation, account for the digestibility. So basically discounting the amount of fatty acids that end up in the feces, right? And looking to only the apparent absorbed fatty acids. And here's what I think is very interesting is on average, my transfer efficiency increase, of course, when I discount the feces, but that coefficient of variation really decreased. So I had a lower, a smaller variation when I look to absorbed fatty acids than when I look to the intake of these fatty acids. And that indicates to us that potentially digestibility differences across palmitic acid supplements can account for a large portion of that variation. So when we think about supplementing palmitic acid, we have to realize that not all the palmitic acid supplements are the same. And we have been doing some work to characterize this better. But when we compare different studies here, and we did the meta-analysis last year looking to that, as well, we observed that degree of enrichment of that palmitic acid is an important factor. So as we drive, a couple years ago, I heard these comment that, if 85% palmitic acid, that's usually the regular supplement is good, and 99% must be better, right? But what usually happens is what we see is as we increase that degree of purity on that fatty acid supplement, the digestibility of the supplement also drops sharply. And this is a good example where the Piantoni study, there was a sharp reduction in digestibility using a 99% supplement. So the degree of enrichment is one of the factors, and that is other factors that we have been characterizing, and this is still working in progress, but the presence of triglyceride or the physical forms of free fatty acid or triglyceride also impact the digestibility of that supplement, and also the presence of other unsaturated fatty acids as well. So all these factors become more important for us to realize right now as we try to reduce inefficiency or trying to be more specific on how we approach feeding different supplements to cows. How this impacting economics? Think about most of the models, we don't have that, but think about that. It's not about how much fatty acids I'm feeding, but what's the target that I want to have cows have available to utilization, or how much absorbed fatty acids I want, to account for these differences in digestibility. And let's suppose your target is 200 grams and you have 4 different supplements varying digestibility between 50 to 75% roughly here, and all these fatty acids cost the same. And your question is how many grams or how many pounds I need to feed, what's the amount of feeding rate for me to achieve that absorbed fatty acid level. And as we can see here, as the digestibility of the supplement reduces, I have to feed more. So my cost per cow per day to deliver the same grams of fatty acids increase. Okay, this is a concept that we don't talk too much about in fatty acid nutrition, is digestibility of different products, digestibility of different supplements, how we drive that. Usually we talk about feeding rate, we talk how many grams should they be targeting, but definitely as we progress knowing the range of these digestibility differences, this is a factor we should be considering. I really think digestibility should be considering in evaluating in a supplement. I think it's hard to quantify right now because most of the available literature will, you have to run this through a cow to have data. We don't have an easy assay like for some protein measurements that we do and estimate RUP digestibility, for example. We don't have that for fatty acids. The nutrition models have limitation because most of the nutrition models will assign fixed values of digestibility either for products or fatty acids, do not account these differences. And I really think should be a parameter that we should start asking in discussing more is characterizing better this digestibility of different supplements help us to drive nutrition forward. As I mentioned before, I don't think you should be so much thinking about how much I'm feeding, but cows respond to the amount of fatty acids that they have absorbed. And I did this analysis looking into the data set that we have with palmitic acid. As we can see, we see a slightly quadratic response. So that is a point, that is a lot of variation, of course. There's other factors that will influence that milk fat yield response. But when it comes to the apparent absorption of palmitic acid, that is a feeding level that response start to be a diminished response as we feed more. The same for 18 carbon fatty acids. This is another data set that came from Sweden, and we look to 18 carbon fatty acids, and that is also, it seems that there is a limit of incorporation in the milk fat. Okay, so in today's economy where we have a reduced return over investment, I would say keep your feeding levels in the linear side of the curve. So let's not overfeed. Let's target moderate levels that can generate a positive return. Switching gears a little bit, I just want to talk briefly about palmitic and oleic and how production level may play a role. I think we have done some research looking to what happens if we vary my palmitic and oleic acid ratio on the supplemental fat, but also I changed some of the production level of the cow. So we did this trial where we vary from an 80-10, 80% palmitic, 10% of oleic, to a 60% palmitic, 30% of oleic. didn't see no effect on feed intake on these cows. They all eat roughly the same. There are no differences on feed intake. What's interesting, we see a quadratic increase in body weight change as we drove more oleic acids. Again, these are cows in positive energy balance. We start trying for cows around 100 days in milk. So this is independent of lactation stage. But what was more interesting was looking to the energy-corrected milk response. We did see an interaction between treatment and production level. So we have, 3 production levels here: low, medium, and high. And what is interesting is, as we drove more oleic acid in those low-producing cows, we see a reduction in energy-corrected milk. But as we drove more oleic acid on those high producing cows, we see in the opposite effect. We see energy-corrected milk going up. So this indicates to us that probably depending on the production level of your herd, of the group that you're feeding, you should be targeting different fatty acids to maximize your response. Okay, so that's one factor that usually we don't take into consideration, but what's the production level of the herd is important. We repeat this study with a wider range of milk production in these cows as well, then only looking to that 80-10 and 630 supplements. So here I have milk yield and energy-corrected milk, and virtually we see the same response. Those lower producing cows, they respond better to that 80-10. We see better response of that 80-10 supplement. For this middle group, it didn't make a difference. I could feed one or the other, and I would say feed whichever is cheaper. And as you go higher in milk production, your response to the oleic becomes more predominant and indicate that, varying that ratio according to the production level is one way that we also have to manipulate the efficiency of this response. How about early lactation cows? There's a lot of questions about if I should be feeding fat to early lactation cows and when I should be feeding fat. That is a common, I would say, agreement or a common sense that, well, perhaps we should be avoiding feeding fat at early lactation. Some of the early studies indicate depression of feed intake, no benefits of adding fat. But again, and some of these studies were done very high feeding levels, very different fat supplements or fat sources that we have available today. So we have done a couple of studies with fresh cows looking to their response. And one was with palmitic acid enriched supplement. And that supplement was fed either on the first 3 weeks, 24 days of lactation, or throughout the first 10 weeks. So in the factorial design of timing. We did not see any difference in feed intake and milk yield in the first 3 weeks of supplementation. Also, no difference in feed intake at all in the first 10 weeks. But on that peak period, after those 3 weeks, we did see a nice increase in milk yield as we feed palmitic acid to these cows. Similar, we did see here then in both periods a very nice response in fat yield and energy-corrected milk. Okay, so this is about 2 to 3 times the response that usually we see in a mid-lactation cow. Okay, when we compare with that basal palmitic acid from most of the studies in mid-lactation. And regardless if we feed or not, at the beginning we did see a response, but partially that increase was driven by changes in body reserves. Cows lose more weight at the beginning of lactation. That was partially related with these lower insulin levels as well. Palmitic acid seems to drive in nutrients towards the mammary gland, suppress some of the insulin response, and specifically driving loss of body weight at the beginning of lactation. That doesn't happen after those 3 weeks, but on the beginning of lactation, that's a factor to consider. We have done follow-up studies on that, thinking about, okay, what happened then if I change my palmitic to oleic acid ratio on that supplemental fat? So in this trial, we did similar to the previous one for fresh cows, where we fed 4 different diets one control and 3, fat supplemented diets with a different ratio. So that 80-10, 80% palmitic, 10% of oleic, we see a very similar response from the previous study with a high palmitic acid supplement. No difference in feed intake, a very nice response in energy correct milk, and a little bit more body weight loss. But look at what happened as we drove more oleic acid into that cow. So as we increase oleic to 10 and to 20 and 30%, removing palmitic acid, we tend to see those cows eating more at their lactation. By the second week, they're producing the same amount of energy milk, and we did not see that change in body weight reserves. So they keep that, they did not lose more body weight comparative control. So this is probably a better approach when you're thinking about fresh cows. And what I like about this study as well is after those 3 weeks, we put all cows in the same carryover diet. And as you can see, because we drove that energy milk higher at the beginning, those cows peak higher. So there was a carryover of that response. So strategically feeding supplemental fat and manipulating the lactation curve is still an interesting topic and interesting point. Even on this depressed market, we know sometime this market will turn, and keeping keeping specifically a good nutrition on that high cows and fresh cows, I think it's important. This is a follow-up study that was repeated, looking to a control versus 60-30 supplement. And what we observed mostly here was an increase in extract milk, similar to the previous study, over those 10 first week, no big changes in body weight reserves. Why oleic acid is really oleic acid, that's changing this metabolism on these cows. So this is a study also done at Michigan State looking into infusing oleic acid, since these previous were feeding that through a calcium salt. And they saw some really nice response. So they infused oleic acid here, and they saw a lower lipolytic response on the adipose tissue from those cows. So they took samples of adipose tissue, looking into that is a lower, that is less lipolysis happening, which agrees with the data on the body weight from the previous study. And also, they look to insulin sensitivity and see that and observe that the adipose tissue of those cows are more sensitive to the action of the insulin because of the oleic acid. So oleic acid is an interesting fatty acid to still consider to be feeding on our lactation. Just as a summary here, how we manage milk fat yield these days, I think we have to focus on the two main points of control: the de novo, how we manage forage quality, feed intake, maintain that rumen health, and avoid high levels of fast ruffle. In supplemental fat, should we be feeding or not? My question would be, what are your goals for feeding? If you're only chasing energy milk, perhaps looking to a lower level, some of these supplements is the way to go. But what type of cows are we feeding? That is cows that benefit more than others as they show up, or lactation cows, for example. Looking to the product, what's the profile, what's fatty acid feeding, what's the digestibility? Those are questions that we have to know before we manage our feeding program. I think in the next several months, milk fat, profitability is reduced, but it's still profitable. Milk protein should be, our goal. Looking is very strong compared to last few years. I think, pushing more starch or fermentable starch is one thing we can do in diets. Altering that ratio of fatty acids strategically, feeding to certain groups of fat. I think overall, all our nutrition models need updates regarding the new knowledge on fatty acid. This is an area that we haven't had a good update in several years. And in terms of palmitic acid, my recommendation would be try to use moderate levels today. It has less value as the butterfat price drops. And I would just like to acknowledge, I know I'm over time probably, as always, but I would just like to thank Dr. Locke from Michigan State for help, and most of this research is done in collaboration. Also, Dr. St. Pierre and Dr. Hutani that help some parts of this presentation. And I'll take any questions if I have time.
Thank you, Dr. De Souza. If people have questions, please enter them into the chat box, and then we can make sure that they get answered. I do have a question related to what you said at the end with ration balancing systems don't necessarily account for all of the nuance with fatty acids. So what are some approaches that you take when you're feeding different groups of cows, or when you're trying to truly mimic the responses we see in research into programs?
Yeah, that's a good question. So a couple things that I look, that I have, the nutrition model helps me to look is, I look to the RUFO levels, I look to the C18-2 levels, I look to my individual fatty acid levels. Then I look back to the research and I say, okay, what's your target here? How many grams? What's the feeding level here? And how can we approach that changing those into a diet? I rarely look anything regarding duodenal estimation of digestibility or something like that, because I think most of the data there needs updates. So most of the control that I do is done in the intake side. Looking how much I'm feeding, where those fatty acids are coming from, what's the source. There's some software really nice. You can look, individually which feed ingredient is contributing to what fatty acids, and those are more my approach to look into that.
Okay, thank you. We have a question that came in. Is fatty acid profile, specifically de novo fatty acid percentage, a good way to measure SARA or to monitor SARA, or is it better to stick with other methods?
That's a good question. I don't think necessarily they could be an indicative of that. I think that is better fatty acids to look into that. There's some nice research looking to wad and branch chain fatty acids as a more robust markers for that. The challenge is the de novo. You can do most of the analysis that have been happen in different labs in the US. They will report de novo through that mid-red technology. That's kind of an NIR, right? And they don't have the ability to do some of these individual fatty acids precisely. But I think if you're looking to monitor, SARA, some of these medium chain, some of these outbreak chain, they are better than the de novos.
Okay, and people can still submit questions if you have them. Regarding your factors that affect palmitic acid transfer efficiency into milk, digestibility appeared to be a really large factor. What do you think are some other factors, because the CV was still relatively large even when you accounted for digestibility? Do you have any thoughts on some other factors that would influence transfer efficiency?
Sure. I think so across those different studies, that is different feeding rates. Okay. So as I show in a graph that I have, the absorbed and the milk fat yield is a quadratic, or tendency for a quadratic relationship. Some of that is feeding rate. So as you go higher levels, your transfer efficiency reduce. Okay. So some is that. And another factor that we already are working on that data set is it seems to be days in milk. That I think is related really with the lactation stage. So as you go to older cows, they become less efficient on that transfer. So that's kind of bring to my point about targeting specific groups of cows. But those are the two other factors that we should be considering.
Okay. And then just as a reminder, if you registered for the social hour, you should have gotten an email with login information. If you didn't, if you wouldn't mind emailing us at virtualdnms@gmail.com, and we can give you that information. I just have one more question about fats, and then if anyone else has questions, please feel free to type them in. For this, you presented a lot of studies, so you might have presented it and I missed it, but for high-producing cows that were fed different percentages of oleic acid, and you had high-producing cows that responded, greater energy-corrected milk. Did you measure any, did you take blood on those? Did you measure insulin? Did you measure glucose in those?
We did. It's interesting because the response on insulin, it depends on the production level as well. So as we fed more oleic to the low producing cows, we see a linear increase on plasma insulin. And I think that's kind of related with the nutrient partitioning. So we see less energy milk, those cows gain more weight. As we did for the high producing cows, there was a quadratic response. It didn't increase to the same extent. And I think on that, metabolic regulation is part of the answer of the oleic acid. So yes, the oleic acid influence the partition of nutrients probably through some insulin mediated mechanism.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. De Souza, for your presentation. And if people have questions that they want to follow up with you on, you did list your email earlier. But thank you for your time, and thank you everyone for their time today. If you want to join the social hour, please feel free to do so. And thank you for all the great presentations today.
Thank you.